If you don't think you can afford health insurance, think again. Now more than ever, New Jersey is committed to making sure everyone has access to affordable health care and understands their options. Health plan rates are down nearly 10% this year, and we could help you find a plan that's right for you. You may even be eligible for financial assistance to help pay for your plan. But remember, open enrollment ends December 15th. Visit getcovered.nj.gov to get started today.
Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome. You're listening to Perfectly Healthy and Toned Radio with your host, Darren Fat Man McDuffie. And now, prepare to get fat. Hey, welcome back to Perfectly Healthy and Toned Radio. I'm your host, Darren Fat Man McDuffie. And tonight we have a great show for you. Might be having some technical difficulties. I'm not sure what's really going on with the show. Hopefully you can hear me. But if you can't, we will maybe end up rescheduling the show. But hopefully you can hear me now. I just saw myself coming on the switchboard. Something is obviously wrong with the switchboard, but hopefully everybody can hear me now. I'm not sure what's going on, but again, this is Perfectly Healthy and Toned Radio, and this kind of threw me off because we might be having a little bit of technical difficulties, but again, hopefully you can hear me and everything is okay. Tonight we have a great guest, but just wanted to remind you about last week's show. If you have not gone to last week's show, then please go back and listen to last week's show where we did a show with Dr. Ronald Drucker on the Code of Life. And really good show there. And we were talking about a little bit about autoimmunity. And as I alluded to on the show last week, we're going to do another show with Dr. Drucker. But to hear him talk about just a little bit about autoimmunity and strengthening and boosting the immune system was worth the price of admission. So if you get a chance, go back to that show and again, listen to Dr. Ronald Drucker, The Code of Life. Tonight, we have another great show, and we're going to be talking about just eating. Stanley Fishman is here, and we're talking about tender grass-fed beef. And I just discovered grass-fed beef a couple of years ago. I used to have stomach problems eating conventional beef, and really someone actually told me a little bit about grass-fed beef, and I decided to try it, and the stomach problems went away. And ever since then, I've been a fan of grass-fed beef. So before we get into the show, as always, let me read Stanley Fishman's bio. Stanley Fishman had been chronically ill with a number of different illnesses since he was 13. His illnesses included asthma, periodic depression, chronic bronchitis, and skin and digestive disorders. He made dozens of trips to the emergency room with asthma attacks that could have killed him. He received extensive medical treatment but only got temporary relief while the underlying illness continued to worsen. He was exposed to toxic chemicals at work in 1998, which again landed him in the emergency room where doctors told him his lungs would never heal. He refused to accept the medical death sentence given to him and sought out to find another way to improve his health. He learned the key to health was nutrition. He believes we are what we eat, and a good diet is the foundation of health and healing. Stanley Fishman, welcome to Perfectly Healthy and Toned Radio. How are you tonight?
I'm doing great, Darren. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. I had some problems with the show. For some odd reason, it would not let me dial in. So apologies to you. I know I usually like for people to call in a little bit early and we get a chance to actually talk offline, so to speak, before we go on. And that was one of the reasons why I couldn't get on. But it's electronics, man. What can you say?
Stuff just happens, you make the best of it.
Yeah, it's
and here
just
we
like,
are.
Yeah, I emailed you before the show and told you I had a death in the family. I just got back to Florida today. I was in South Carolina, and that's probably how my day went. I was coming back here, some traffic jams in West Palm Beach, and a traffic jam and accident as I made it my way back to the house here. So
Lord.
It's been a day here, and I'm ready to do this. But I guess the first question is just tell me a little bit about, or tell me and the audience rather, a little bit about your childhood, it seems like you had a number of illnesses, Stanley.
Well, yeah, you see what happened. I'd been pretty healthy. I was actually a pretty darn good football player up through the age of 12 and was big and strong and had no problems. Then we moved to a new county, and I had some real problems with allergies. And unfortunately, my father took me to this allergist who had a revolutionary new treatment where he would put people on all-soy diets. Nobody's doing that anymore, thank God. But I think that probably threw me totally out of balance just when I was going through puberty. Bad time for that to happen. And things just really went downhill from then. Instead of the allergies getting better, I developed this asthma, skin problems, all kinds of things. I couldn't even go to high school. I had to be taught by a tutor at home. And things got a bit better, and then they'd get worse, and they'd get better and worse, and it was that way through most of my life. And I was a good patient. I went to the doctors, did what they said, took my inhalers and my medicines and all that, and they would give temporary relief, and the underlying problem would just get worse and worse. And you read it a bit in the introduction, but things finally hit bottom in 1998, where after I was exposed to some chemical fumes at work and was rushed to the hospital once again, I was had an interview with a couple of doctors who had really bad news for me. And at one point, when they were, one of them I think was saying that I'd be lucky to make it another 5 years, something happened in my mind. I just decided that no, I'm not going to accept this. These guys can't do anything for me. I've been doing what they said for a very long time, and it's not working, so I have to find something else. And I just made this really strong decision, a very emotional one, okay? I have a wife and a son who I love dearly, and there was no way that I was going to leave them if I could do anything about it. So I just decided I'd find another way to get well. And that was the motivation, and since then, I pretty much gave up on conventional medicine, not because I wanted to, but simply because it wasn't any good for me. And I was a pretty good researcher as an attorney. I knew how to research and look for information and analyze it. And I began trying every kind of alternative thing I could find that seemed to make any sense. Most of them didn't work. Some made things worse temporarily. Some of them gave me relief, so I didn't need to use medications to control asthma attacks anymore. For me, it was as simple as coffee and drinking a lot of water. And but I kind of reached a sticking ground to where I could stop the really bad things from happening, but I was weak and ill and not able to do that much. And then I came across the writings of Dr. Weston A. Price, I think you have some familiarity with.
Yeah, I do.
Yes, and I became kind of fascinated by the whole idea of what he did, where he traveled the world and found all these people who were supposedly primitive, but they were actually much healthier than the supposedly more advanced civilizations of his time, like the Europeans and the United States. These were people who didn't have the chronic diseases we had, and they had really healthy teeth. So I studied his book, went to the website of the Weston A. Price Foundation and began adjusting my diet. And, funny thing is, I started getting better. What I was doing was I was concentrating on just making my body work well, every part of it, and hoping that would give it the power to resist the illness and to heal things. And that helped quite a bit, but I still was in a weak physical state. There was a lot of stuff that I couldn't do. And then I came across the idea of grass-fed meat. Now, this is going to sound really silly, but sometimes this is how we get inspiration. There was a book I'd read when I'd been a child called Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates, and it was about this little Dutch boy who was a really great skater, and he wanted to skate in this race and win the prize, which would be a pair of silver skates. And he came from a very poor family, but he was a really good skater, and he wanted those skates more than anything in the world. And so, he won the race, and he won the skates, as I remember it. But his father was injured in an accident badly, and the doctors basically told him and his family that his father couldn't get well unless they could get him meat to eat. That's not what you hear today, but this was written a while ago, and they believed back then that you needed meat to get strength back. And they were poor, and there was no way that they could get the meat. So what he did, as I remember it, is that he sold the skates and used the money to buy meat for his father, and his father ate the meat and got well. And that just kept coming to my mind, so I began researching meat, and realizing that the type of meat that most of us eat in the United States was just not what our ancestors ate. It was fed wrong. It was very different in its chemical composition. It just wasn't the same stuff, so I decided to switch to grass-fed in the hope that it would do for me what it had done in that book. And when I started finding some grass-fed meat and I cooked it and I tried to eat it, it was terrible. It tasted bad. It was really tough. I couldn't stand it. Then it came to me that I probably just didn't know how to cook it, and at that time there wasn't that much advice on how to cook it either. The people who sold the meat would say things like, well, don't cook it as long and don't cook it as hot. Well, not very detailed. So I began researching a number of old cookbooks when the only meat they had around was grass-fed, and I tried one thing and another. And when I was able to get it to be, after a lot of work, when I was able to get the meat to be tender and delicious, and I started being able to eat it, my strength came back. I felt. It's hard to explain how I felt, but I just felt the strength and vitality coming back, and I could climb stairs easily again, and I could do all these things physically that I couldn't do before without strain. It was really rejuvenating. And that was essentially how I got into it. And then I had a strong desire to share what I had learned because it wasn't written down anywhere that I could find. And that led me to write my first book, Tender Grass-Fed Meat.
Great. I wanted to go back to 98. And in 98, obviously you had the episode with the chemical and the films, and you decided to, did you decide at that time to kind of go away from the medical establishment after 1998?
I decided right when they were telling me that I probably had no more than 5 years left, that I didn't want to hear any more of this, and I didn't want to buy into it, and I didn't, and that this, that this path that I'd followed of just going with established medicine just wasn't going to work out for me, because what they were telling me is that it wouldn't work out.
Yeah.
So at that point,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that right there, while they were telling me that, I didn't even hear everything they said. My mind just kind of shut it off. And I decided, no, I've got to find something else.
Yeah. You said you had a moment of inspiration, but I would imagine at that point when you made a decision to say, you know what, I'm not going to be, I guess you would say, a puppet to the medical establishment.
A patient.
Yeah. Patient puppet. But
right.
I imagine there was a certain amount of fear in stepping away. Did you have a certain amount of fear, and how did you kind of maybe talk that fear down?
Well, there was a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of potential fear. But, what I found is that a lot of emotion can be turned around, and I realized that being scared wasn't going to help me. It was just going to slow me down and paralyze me with indecision. So it's kind of like when I felt that fear, I turned it into I'm going to survive, and I'm going to get well, and no matter what, I'm going to do that. Nothing else is ever going to happen. And whenever I felt that fear, I just tried to turn that energy into this positive belief that I could do, that there was something out there that I could do. I mean, I'd known some people. I'd known a couple of people who had cured cancer through alternate means, which was, a much more difficult thing to deal with than what I had, and other people who had not used conventional medicine but were very healthy, and so I'd reassure myself with thoughts of them. A whole lot was racing through my mind as that went through there. But, I have had, from life experience, I've kind of developed the belief that to a certain degree we have a choice into how to react with the things that life gives us, that there's different directions we can go into, and most of the time we have a lot of choice in how we go there. I could go the route of fear and just letting the doctors do what they could to try to extend my life a little bit or make me more comfortable, or I could just refuse to accept that way of looking at things and take a different approach. So I just really focused all my emotional energies there.
Yeah,
and
good
so,
stuff.
So when I felt the fear, I just tried to refuse to accept it and to turn it into something else.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that fear when they step away from the medical establishment and kind of put their healing in their own hands. Another question for you, and nothing against my people who might be listening who are vegan or vegetarian. You do what you do. But you told a story about, I believe it was Hans and the silver skates. Normally in our culture right now, it seems as though a vegan or vegetarian diet is the diet that kind of brings back people to their health or back to their roots, their healthy roots, so to speak. Outside of that story, was the story the thing that really inspired you to kind of move towards meat? Because usually in our society right now, they're telling people that meat isn't good for us. Most people are moving towards a plant-based diet or something of that nature. But were there any hesitancies in you with regards to maybe eating beef instead of moving to something that was more plant-based or moving toward a vegetarian diet?
Well, not really, because I for whatever reason, I do think that we're all individuals, and none of us are exactly the same in terms of how things affect us. I had tried vegetarianism at a younger age, and it just didn't work for me. I just felt weak all the time, and I realized other people might have different responses, but it never really did seem an option for me. But I think, like when you were talking about at the beginning of the show that you had trouble digesting, let's say, conventional meat.
Yes.
I think there is such a huge difference between the grass-fed meat and the conventional meat. It's like they're not even the same thing. I know that's a bold statement to make. But the other thing that I think moved me in that not being turned toward a plant-based diet, and I mean no disrespect to anybody who's going that way, and if they have great results from it, that's great. But when I studied Dr. Price's work, the interesting thing was the thing that motivated him, and I read this and it kind of resonated with me. You see, he actually started out as a vegetarian, and when he began his journey to find out what the healthy peoples in the world were eating that made them healthy, he looked at some photos of some so-called primitive people and noticed how much better their teeth were than the teeth of his patients, because he was a dentist. And he had noticed that every generation of his patients was weaker and sicker and had worse teeth than the preceding generation. What he expected to find was, when he went all over the world, and he went to Europe and to Africa and to Polynesia and to South America, and he spent 10 years doing this. Nobody, I think, has ever done such a comprehensive face-to-face study. He expected to find that these people would be vegetarians. But what he found instead is that the basis of the diet of each and every one of them were animal foods, but they were not they would eat some vegetables, some would eat some grains, some wouldn't. There were a couple who ate nothing but meat. There was like a tribe of Native Americans in northern Canada who, for most of the year, the only food they could get was moose, but they would eat the whole moose, the internal organs, and all of that. And so, since Price was kind of my inspiration, and he was talking about foods that could really make a difference for people, and butter was one of the foods that he really emphasized a lot, and fish fats and things like that, but also the fat of wild animals and grass-fed animals. I thought, if this is the road that these people went, that's the road I should go too. So that's just what called to me from my studies and research.
Yeah, I need to read that book. I keep saying I'm going to read it. I've read countless books for the show. I just haven't gotten to the Weston A. Price book. That's actually on my to-do list. And for the audience, I might have gotten cut off because we had some technical difficulties, but I shared a story that Stanley had alluded to about having stomach issues. I actually quit beef in college and didn't eat beef again until 2011, I believe. And then my first venture back into beef was grass-fed beef through a friend's restaurant here in Florida. Stanley, one of the things that really kind of blew me back with grass-fed beef was the taste. Like, the taste is so much richer from what I had remembered previously when I used to eat conventional beef, and they would give us hamburgers in the cafeteria in college. And I remember those burgers compared to my first venture back in was actually a burger, and it was grass-fed beef, but the taste was so much richer. What makes grass-fed beef have such a much more rich taste?
Well, I'd say it's basically the grass, because the difference between grass-fed beef and more conventional beef is that really grass-fed beef, all they eat is what nature intended them to eat, which is grass and meadow plants. And the grass itself is the best possible food for these cattle. You know, it makes them happy. It makes them healthier. It's, you know, the meat is leaner, but the fat in there is much richer in omega-3s and has a perfect balance of omega-3 versus omega-6. Whereas, every grass-fed rancher who's any good knows that the best way to get good meat is to keep the cattle as happy as you can make them. You know, to keep them peaceful, content, satisfied. And, you know, I've known of guys who will plant shade trees for the cattle so they can go in the shade when they want to and do all kinds of things to try to keep them happy. And when they're happier, they're healthier, and and you have the goodness of that rich grass from the soil, which they've been eating for, you know, I don't even know how long, which is what they were meant to eat and which they can easily digest. Whereas when they're eating the stuff they give them in the feedlots, the soy and who knows what else, it's not their natural diet, and it upsets their stomach, and then they're crowded together and can't graze and in terrible conditions. So to me, it just makes total sense why the grass-fed beef tastes so much better. You know, there is, it partly depends on how good the grass is. If you get grass-fed beef where the pasture isn't very good, it won't taste that good. But if you get it from good pasture, and I've had it from a number of different places, and there's a difference in the taste. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more about it tasting so much better. And I've reached the point now that on the rare occasion where I try conventional beef, it upsets my stomach, and I can't stand the taste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I won't eat it. I was just at home this past weekend, as I mentioned, and we had a cookout, and I just didn't touch any of the hamburger. I was like, if it's not grass-fed, I'm not touching it, because I remember how it would upset my stomach when I ate it previously, and I was like, no, it's not worth it. I'll just wait till I get back to Florida where I can get some grass-fed beef, because obviously it doesn't upset my stomach, and obviously it tastes so much better than the conventional beef. Getting into the content of the beef, well, before I get into the content of the beef, I just wanted to ask you about CLA. But going back to a previous question when we were talking about vegetarian, vegan diets and plant-based diets, can we eat too much grass-fed beef? Is there such thing as eating too much? Is there a fine line about how much we should be eating?
Well, I'll tell you my experience with it, which is that when I switched to grass-fed beef, I found I was satisfied with half or less the quantity than I was when I was trying to eat the other beef. And by satisfied, I mean that, at first you start eating, it tastes really good and you want more, and then you suddenly reach a point where you've had enough. And I lose the desire to eat anymore. And the way I look at it is that the meat, the grass-fed meat with the CLA and these other nutrients that we really need and our bodies want to have and are really good for us, that once we get enough, the hunger stops. I think a lot of the overeating and the binge eating that we have so much in our society is simply because the nutrients in the food that our body expects, like when they eat meat, are often just not there because of the way the meat has been processed, or even the vegetables for that matter, or being grown in poor soil or whatever. But personally, I could not eat too much grass-fed meat because once I've had enough, my appetite shuts off and I can't eat anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the best way I can answer your question is from my personal experience. And I also know from observing family members and friends that they will eat a lot less. They'll be satisfied with a lot less of it, even though they'll like it more.
Yeah,
if that
I'm that way.
Sense.
Yeah, I'm that way with the ground grass-fed beef. It's like you can eat. I remember I literally would sit down when I ate conventional, and I would eat 3 or 4 hamburgers with buns. And then, with the grass-fed, you kind of want to savor the taste because it tastes so good. It's like, okay, I'm just going to take my time and eat this one burger here, and I'm gluten-free, so every now and then I'll delve into a gluten-free bun and have a burger. But I just kind of want to savor the taste, and usually one is enough for me. I don't want any more. With regards to the terms, there are several terms out there that are thrown around. I think sometimes people really get confused. One of them is grass-fed, grass-finished, and then you have grass-fed, grain-finished, and then I believe you have some other terms that are out there. But talk to us a little bit about what the differences are.
Okay, sure. Okay, well, grass-fed is a bit confusing because basically all cattle are grass-fed up to a point. And what makes a difference is what happens after you reach that point. For most cattle, they get shipped to a feedlot, and then they aren't allowed to graze, and then they're given a diet that includes different kinds of grains like corn and soy, but it can even include stuff like bakery rubbish. Literally mean stale bakery goods and used candy bars, and I don't know who exactly feeds who what, but that sort of stuff does get fed, and none of it's natural. Now that is not generally not called grass-fed, but some butchers will call it grass-fed and say that they can because they were grass-fed before they went to the feedlot. I don't consider that to be grass-fed. Now grass-finished, grass-fed grain-finished would mean that you would, when you reach that point, you would finish the cattle on grain. It might not necessarily be in a feedlot, or it might be in a smaller feedlot that fed only grain as opposed to some of this other stuff, or only certain types of grain. But you would not finish them on grass. Now, when I say grass-fed, at this point I mean grass-fed and grass-finished. Grass-finished means essentially that the cattle eat nothing but grass their entire life. And finishing cattle means getting them up to where they're reasonably fat, and there's going to be some good fat in their meat, and they're eating the best grass of the year. And it used to be quite an art. I've talked to different ranchers there, and before, when they would finish their cattle, there'd be this special pasture where the soil was really good and the grass was rich and green and long, and they'd only use that pasture to finish cattle. And once they'd finish their cattle on that pasture, that's the point where they would sell them for processing, but they wouldn't send them to a feedlot, and they'd be grazing their whole lives. I personally think that not only does that make for the best tasting meat and the healthiest, I've seen some studies where they showed that once you put a grass-fed cow in a feedlot, by the time they finish this 90 to 180 days in the feedlot, or however long they have them there, the amount of CLA and omega-3s in their meat, it was actually tested scientifically, has gone down enormously to almost nothing from what it was before. So the other thing about grass finishing is that it's the kindest to the cattle. I think it's terrible to put them in feedlots. And, they're basically living if the rancher's any good, and I've known some real good ranchers, they're living a happy life up to the point that they get shipped off, and if the slaughterhouse does its job rightly, they get killed without even knowing they're ever in danger. So it's a more humane way of doing it. I hope that kind of explains it, but essentially, to most people, grass-fed means that it isn't grain-finished, but Some butchers will say any meat is grass-fed because it's been grass-fed for a while but finished on grain or in a feedlot. But grass-fed and grass-finished is what I think of as grass-fed meat. But it's more precise to say grass-fed, grass-finished. And if I was asking a source or a rancher about their meat, I would always make sure that they finish them on grass.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if the grass-fed, grass-finished is the best one out there for the listeners.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's what you're eating, and it's what I always try to eat. And it does taste so much better, as you know.
Yeah, for those of you out there listening, I mean, if you taste conventional beef and you taste grass-fed beef, trust me, you won't want to go back to conventional beef. It just tastes so much better. One of the things I noticed when I first ventured into getting my own grass-fed beef and cooking it is that I didn't have to put my heat setting so high. Like with when I used to cook conventional beef, I know that I had to put the heat setting so much higher when I made stuff. But I noticed with the grass-fed beef that you don't have to put the heat setting so high. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One is because of what grain feeding and feedlot feeding does to a cow. There's a lot more like water or liquid in the meat of a conventional cow than there is a grass-fed one. It's some kind of biological thing, and I don't understand exactly how it works, but I know that's there. So because the meat is wetter, you have to cook it at higher heat to deal with all that moisture. But if you cook grass-fed at that high heat, it's going to be tough and not as good. So, one of the things that I usually advise is if you're making a grass-fed burger or a grass-fed steak is to cook it at a medium heat, not a high heat, because the meat will still be brown and be very nice. But it doesn't need that high heat, and in fact, that type of high heat isn't good for it in terms of eating it.
Yeah. What about the whole way of the cooking with it? I've noticed with grass-fed beef, like I was never a guy who would go to a restaurant and order maybe a medium well. I always had to have well done. But when I'm eating grass-fed beef, I noticed that medium well doesn't bother me as much. Rare, I don't know if I like rare. I know some people out there who eat rare. But in order to enjoy it the most, are you still looking at it from an individual standpoint? Like I like stuff medium well. With grass-fed beef, well done to me is it kind of seems like it's overcooked. So any pointers out there for the way you would like for it to be cooked to kind of make it taste the best it can taste?
Well, I would probably say that it tastes the best it can taste for most people at medium rare, which means that it's, red and warm in the center, kind of pink going out there. You can actually get grass-fed meat to be very, very good if you cook it to medium well, but that's not so, and I usually have burgers that way. You can stews and pot roasts are that way. You can cook, if you slow cook some roasts, like at a low temperature, you can get them to be very tender and still be medium well. But for myself, at this point, medium rare is what I prefer. Dr. Price advised eating meats that were rare because he thought they had more nutrients that way. But I think you still get plenty of nutrition at medium rare, and I think you still get plenty of it at medium well, though maybe not quite as much. But it is, to a great deal, a matter of personal taste. Now, one thing that I will say is that on the rare occasions where I can get grass-fed bison, I like it really rare. Really, really rare, much more rare than I do beef. And I find that to be the most strengthening, reviving food I've ever eaten. Again, that's kind of a personal thing, but I cooked it that rare by accident once, and then I found that I really liked it, but I don't like beef that rare. Can't explain the difference to you, but
I've tried bison, and it's one of those meats that's really red, I would say.
Yes.
But and I like lamb as well. I guess we're doing this show about tender grass-fed beef, and I have to make a confession that beef is my second favorite meat. I actually really love lamb. Lamb is my first favorite. And you have
God
a number.
Bless you. I love lamb too. Go ahead.
But I mean, lamb is my favorite, and then beef is second. And I mean, I used to be, when I pull conventional beef out of my diet, it used to be chicken, and it's like, okay, no, now I like lamb, and then my second one is beef, and then maybe chicken. Well, and then it's bison. Then it's bison, and then chicken. I don't know. Chicken just got further away from me as I started to discover, grass-fed. Really good grass-fed meats. One of the things that I'm really interested in is seasoning, optimal seasoning. Do you season the meat before? Like, growing up with a single mother as I did, I used to watch my mom season the meat before and then put it into the oven. Is it any difference between the grass-fed meat? Should you season it after, or are you seasoning the meat before you do it? You put it in the oven?
Well, I think it depends partly on the seasoning you use. If you're going to season it with salt, I would put the salt on just before I put it in the oven.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't believe in salting grass-fed meat and just letting it sit in the salt for a long time, because that seems to dry out. It has a lot less water and seems to dry out some of the juices. But it's always worked fine to season it just before putting it in.
And with regards to marinade, because I've tried various different things to marinate the meats, and I actually, in the book you talk about fish sauce, and I used to date someone who was really into fish sauce, and I'm wondering what's the taste of that. I've never really tried it. I've actually used fermented soy on seasoning some of the meats, but you've kind of probably done more than I've done with experimenting with this stuff. What's the best marinade?
Well, one way to make the meat more tender is to marinate it, and is to make the base of your marinade be olive oil, extra virgin olive oil. Unfiltered olive oil works even better. And I got, when I was researching how they used to cook grass-fed meat, one thing that really struck me is I'd be reading cookbooks from Poland, cookbooks from Italy, cookbooks from Russia, from France, from Spain, and the Balkans, and just about all of them would say, put some olive oil on the meat prior to cooking. So it occurred to me that since the only meat they had back then was grass-fed, that there's a point to doing this. And so a typical marinade for me will have an olive oil base, but there's all kinds of other things that I can add to it. Like you can... one thing that I like doing is adding some flavorful whiskey to that. There's a recipe in my book for Irish whiskey steak, which is simplicity itself. It's like a few tablespoons of olive oil, a couple tablespoons of Irish whiskey, some green onions, and that's it. But it's one of the best steaks that I've ever had. But fish sauce, it also depends on the fish sauce, because there's so many different kinds out there. Just, there's some fish sauce that they have all kinds of additives to it, MSG, lots of sugar, you name it, and that's not the traditional stuff. But I've become a real fan of Red Boat fish sauce, which is a fish sauce from Vietnam that's become pretty available over here. I don't know if you have Trader Joe's in Florida, but they carry it at a fairly decent price, and that's made the old traditional way, nothing but anchovies and salt, and the essence. And the fish sauce is highly recommended by the Weston A. Price Foundation, because you have the internal organs of the fish dissolving into the liquid that you use, so it's a great way to get sea nutrients, and it adds a tremendous amount of flavor. And then I also use all kinds of different vegetable ingredients, like, one way to help make meat tender and more flavorful is just to puree an onion and marinate the meat in that with some other ingredients. There's other vegetables that can do the same. There's I could keep you here for the next 24 hours, and I'm not kidding, talking about all the different things you can use.
That's okay.
But basically, putting some olive oil on it and then some other things for flavor. If you like garlic, you can do that. You can use different spices. It can be very simple. That's the beauty of grass-fed meat. You can use a very simple marinade, and it can be absolutely wonderful. maybe 3 or 4 ingredients, and you can just cook it really easily, and you can have a great steak. Hamburgers don't really need a marinade, but you can use all kinds of different spices with them. And I still am trying out new things, and I'm still learning more things, and I'm never going to have enough time, not if I had another 300 years to exhaust the possibilities, but it's kind of fun too.
Yeah, you're the man when it comes to beef. That Red Boat fish sauce, actually we do have Trader Joe's here, but that Red Boat fish sauce it's fermented as well, right?
Yeah, it is fermented. It's
okay.
It's really interesting. I've corresponded with the guy who founded the company because he's really brought back the traditional way of making fish sauce. Now most fish sauce, they use chemicals to make the fermentation happen, which I don't think is real fermentation. And his family had a background in it, and when he found that he couldn't get it anymore, he actually went to this island, Phu Quoc Island, off the coast of South Vietnam, which is the place that the best fish sauce traditionally came from. They're supposed to have pretty clean waters there, and they have a lot of anchovies. So essentially what his factory does there is they catch a number of anchovies, just like they've been doing for maybe 1,000 years or more, put them in these huge wooden barrels, put salt on them, expose them to the sun, and have wooden screens in the bottom so the liquid comes out with the salt, and that way you have all of the nutrients and essence of the fish, and the flavor of this stuff is so much better than any other fish sauce I've ever had. It's kind of like the difference between grass-fed beef and conventional beef.
Yeah. What would be an example of something you might want to use a fish sauce on to marinate?
Okay. Sure. Well, if you want a little more of an exotic taste in your meat, for example, sometimes I'll stir-fry meat, both leftover meat as well as fresh meat, and often in the marinade instead of soy sauce, because I generally try to avoid soy, having had far too much of it at one time. I use fish sauce as a substitute. It doesn't taste the same. It has its own flavor, but you can substitute and get a very nice dish for a nice flavor from it. Or, one of the things that I found out is that in a number of European cuisines, like Italian and so forth, they would use anchovies to flavor red meat, believe it or not. And this fish sauce is made from anchovies, so a little bit of that can get that flavor there, and it doesn't taste like anchovies once it cooks. It adds a nice flavor to the meat. Another thing that might interest you a bit is, since you like lamb, is that there's a big tradition in France and Italy of seasoning lamb with anchovies, with salted anchovies. I found that you can get a real nice effect by just using some fish sauce, and that can give you a very nice flavor too. So you can use it in a marinade for just about any kind of meat.
Yeah, I have to try that with the lamb. I was using soy sauce, and but I'll have to try that with the lamb. Does cookware make any of a difference? Because I know when I was coming up, we used to fry hamburgers, and now I'm much more of an oven person. Like I put something in the oven. Is a ceramic or steel cookware going to make a difference? Let's say we have people out there who still want to fry their grass-fed meat for a burger or something. Is a cookware going to make a difference with that?
Well, I think so. My belief is that, I never use any kind of aluminum or Teflon or, specifically non-stick cookware. I'm more of a believer in traditional things. Stainless steel is good in terms of what I use because, the problem with the Teflon and the aluminum is that some of the taste of the metal can get into the meat, not to mention that there's a controversy about whether the the metal that's released through cooking is good for people. I don't think it is, but I'm no expert, and I try to do things traditionally. But I would say that ceramic can be very good too, as long as it's not the type of ceramic where they put lead and other stuff into it that could leach into the meat. But I basically use stainless steel. I've got these cast iron pans that I've had forever, which are practically non-stick, just beautiful, smooth black. They just kind of gleam, and I probably use them for making hamburgers, but I'll also make them on the grill, or if I want to make them in the oven, I can put them on some stainless steel or a stainless steel rack or something like that. And I think it does make a difference. Cast iron to me seems to be pretty good for, frying meat if you're going to do that. But I also use a cast iron casserole for stews and pot roast because I think the way you can cook that at a low heat and it retains the heat and radiates it all over the meat and cooks it from all sides and gives a very nice effect.
Getting into just talking a little bit about the barbecue. Well, before I talk about the barbecue, because I want to ask you what your recommendation is on maybe a barbecue sauce. But before I talk about the barbecue, well, just go ahead with the barbecue. I'm sorry. If you can just give us some recommendations on the barbecue, maybe doing the barbecue sauce, if you have a recommendation on that.
Well, it's, my book, Tender Grass-Fed Barbecue, when I was looking into barbecue, the Weston A. Pratt Foundation had, and some other people have said that there's a problem with cooking meat directly over the fire, that there's some kind of substances, I forget what they call them, that can be created by the fat or whatever falling onto the fire and then being pushed back into the meat. So I did some research on it and found that a lot of the old barbecue cooking wasn't done over a direct hot fire, but was more of an indirect cooking method, which I, describe the one I use in detail in Tender Grass-Fed Barbecue. Basically, you build a charcoal or wood fire or wood and charcoal fire on one side of the barbecue, put a drip pan underneath the grill, which makes it a lot easier to clean, and put the meat next to rather than directly over the hot part of the fire. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't give you really charred meat, but it gives you some really nice meat too. And that's generally the way that I do it. I don't grill directly over the coals anymore, though I used to. But with this method, usually a covered grill like what I use in the book is a Weber. You can avoid flare-ups. You can control the temperature very well by adjusting the vents. And, I found all kinds of ways to barbecue all kinds of things that were very successful. It was kind of a new way of cooking to me because I know this came out of the Weston A. Pratt Foundation saying, you don't want to eat barbecued meats. And then I love barbecue, so I began reading the studies and finding out that what they always objected to was the heat source being directly under the meat.
Yes.
And so if you remove that, then I think you remove the problem. Yeah. And it turned out to be delicious. Now, as for a barbecue sauce, you're talking about a sauce that you might serve with the barbecue, or?
Yeah, for instance, most of the time people want maybe something like a barbecue chicken. Some people even like barbecue burgers. I've had those before, and but I'm interested in maybe your recommendation, making your own sauces. There's a barbecue sauce that you might recommend. Since we're in the heart now of a grilling season, I think July 4th was the peak of people starting to cook out because everybody did a cookout for 4th of July, but we're still into those lazy days of summer. So you might have some people out there who are looking for a healthy alternative to barbecue sauce or something that doesn't have the MSG and other stuff in it. So I was just interested in your recommendation for that.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty good question. I've tried for a long time to find one that didn't have that stuff in there or didn't have too much sugar or didn't have too many sweeteners, and I haven't really seen a commercial one that you can just buy that satisfies my concerns in those regards. One of the key things in the Weston A. Price style eating method is to avoid sugar, like the plague, basically. And people generally like sweet sauces. I have made some barbecue sauces myself where instead of sugar, I might add a grated apple or apple juice or even pineapple juice, where you get the sweetness directly from fruit rather than from refined sugars. And some of those have turned out to be pretty nice. But, I'm sorry to say that I haven't come across any commercial barbecue sauces that I feel can satisfy my concerns in that regard. But it is possible to make your own.
Yeah, my mom made her own, used to make her own, but she passed away, and unfortunately I didn't. I didn't get her recipe. It was like a secret recipe. I think my sister knows how to make it partly. I'll have to get in contact with her and see, how to actually make it. One of the things, too, and this is my last question, Stanley, was organ meats. I noticed that you had a lot of different recipes in here for what I would call hiding organ meats. And for the audience, for those out there who don't know what that is, can you explain that for the audience and give some recommendations for what you like to do to get the vitamins from the organ meats, but not have to actually taste them?
Darren, you put it so well. Here it's kind of a nutritional puzzle. And our organ meats from healthy animals, grass-fed animals, I would say, are really healthy. They've got great nutritional value. I think, so many the traditional peoples Dr. Price studied, they all ate organ meats, and they all prized organ meats. I mean, they'd rather eat liver than steak. And the problem is that, just to be honest with you, that dealing with raw organ meats is downright disgusting. I don't know how, you know what I mean, trying to get the membranes off and all that. It's not a lot of fun, and they usually have a slimy texture and so forth. But it used to be, at least when I was growing up, people tried to force their children to eat liver or something like that at least once a week, because it was felt that it was necessary for good health, and maybe they knew something. So what I found, and this is a cheat, okay? It is a cheat that there are some people who sell grass-fed meat over the internet who make some very good organ sausages. My favorite is one that is pretty close to a third liver, grass-fed liver, a third grass-fed kidney, a third grass-fed heart. It's cooked in sausage form, but a lot of my recipes just call for taking that or something similar and making it into a meatloaf. One of the best ways you can disguise the taste, and this was done in Europe for centuries, is if you chop some onions and brown them in a lot of butter until they get kind of golden, then they're really sweet. And if you put mix those onions into any type of liver dish, that really does help with the taste problem. But generally, if you can make liver so it looks like a hamburger or a meatloaf, and you like the recipes you were mentioning, you put enough things in there to change the taste and distract the taste from what it really is. It can be really good and feel good to eat it.
Yeah, I used to put it in hamburger meat and really kind of disguise it. You wouldn't even know that you were eating it. And I lied. I actually have one more question for you. I bumped into a lot of people, Stanley, who say that they don't like meat. And I'm wondering, I never really ask any of my friends who say that they don't like meat that much, but I'm wondering if it might have been, and you've had more experience maybe talking to people about grass-fed beef, if those people were eating conventional meats and they just didn't have the type of taste that a grass-fed meat actually has, a grass-fed meat, the taste that grass-fed meat has, rather. Have you bumped into these people who say they don't really like the taste of meat, and what's been your experience with that? This question just came to me as a last question, because I'd be interested in hearing it from you, since you obviously talk to people about this all the time. Have you had any experience where these people, you tell them to try grass-fed beef and they went to try grass-fed beef and actually found out that, yes, I like the taste over conventional type meat?
In fact, that's usually what happens when I get those kind of questions. Normally when I talk to people like that, they're not even aware that there's a difference between grass-fed meat and other meat. They just think that meat is meat, and what they've been eating is what most people eat, which is what I call factory meat, the conventional meat that neither you nor I ever want to put in our mouths again. And I don't blame them for not liking it. I don't like it. But those who've tried grass-fed meat have been very pleasantly surprised by it. So I'm not saying that everybody who dislikes meat is going to like it if they try grass-fed. I've known some people who just can't deal with the idea of eating meat for various reasons. But for people who just don't like the taste, if they try properly cooked, good grass-fed, most of the ones that I've talked to about or suggested something and have written back to me or called me on the phone about it have been much happier with the grass-fed meat, and I'm including lamb as well as beef because I think grass-fed lamb is a great thing too.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question, yeah, I've seen that happen a lot. A lot of people who don't like meat. I don't think I've ever met anybody who didn't like meat who was only eating grass-fed meat. Let me put it that way. And just about everyone that I did talk to just thought that all meat is the same, which, it's interesting because with factory meat, as I call it, they have some way of making it taste all the same. The first time I got bison, the producers were bragging that they got it to taste just like beef, and by God, it tasted just like beef, and I didn't like it because they were feeding it the same or doing something. But I probably over-answered your question, but yeah.
No, that's okay, yeah. And that was my last question. And your books are Tender Grass-Fed Barbecue and Tender Grass-Fed Beef and Tender Grass-Fed Meat. And where can the audience get those books?
Best place to do that would be Amazon.
Okay. And you have a website as well. What's your website, Stanley? They want to check out more.
tendergrassfedmeat.com.
Yep. So, guys, go to tendergrassfedmeat.com and pick up the books. They're well worth it. There are a lot of recipes in here for those of you who are just delving into cooking your grass-fed meat. It'll save you a lot of time and a lot of mishaps because I know I had a bunch of them when I started. But, Stanley, thank you so much for being on tonight, man. I really enjoyed it.
Well, it was an honor and a pleasure to do this, Darren. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye now.
Bye. All right, guys. Thank you for listening tonight. Those of you who might be listening on iTunes, please leave me a review. Kind of out of sorts tonight. I traveled back from South Carolina, had a funeral. My godmother actually passed away last weekend, and I attended her funeral this past Friday. And got back in here, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and had a bunch of stuff to do. So I was kind of out of sorts and then had a little bit of issues with the Blog Talk Radio. But got everything going, and the show is out there. So take a listen to the show. And I hadn't looked at the schedule. I know I have someone that's going to be on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, but I have no idea who it's going to be. Like I said, things have been a whirlwind since I got back. Barely had any time to breathe here, but I wanted to get a show in the books, so to speak, for tonight, and I had Stanley Fishman on the schedule, so really wanted to do this show. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Tender Grass-Fed Barbecue and Tender Grass-Fed Beef. Go pick those books up on Amazon. They're well worth just learning how to cook beef, because I believe that when we cook things and season them properly, we really enjoy our food a whole lot more. So thank you for listening tonight. Peace and love, y'all. And again, I'll be back Wednesday, same fat time, same fat channel. Good night.
Sure, you're healthy now, but health insurance isn't about now. It's about being covered for the unexpected. When an accident or injury happens, the last thing you should worry about is how to pay for your health care. GetCovered.nj.gov can help you find an affordable plan that's right for you. You may even be eligible for financial assistance. But remember, open enrollment ends December 15th. So visit getcovered.nj.gov and find a health plan that keeps you covered, no matter what life throws at you.
Hi, it's Jamie, Progressive's Employee of the Month, 2 months in a row. Leave a message at the... Hi, Jamie. It's me, Jamie. I just had a new idea for our song about the Name Your Price tool. So when it's like, tell us what you want to pay, hey, 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 and the trombone goes, blah, 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 and you say, we'll help you find coverage options to fit your budget. Then we just all do finger snaps while a choir goes, savings coming at ya, savings coming at ya. Yes? No? Maybe? Anyway, see you practice tonight. I got new lyrics for the rap break.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.